Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Robert Vinten. He's a postdoctoral research fellow within a project on epistemic injustice, and previously also a postdoctoral research fellow on a project on the epistemology of religious belief at the NOVA University of Lisbon. And today we're going to focus on a book he is the editor of, Wittgenstein and the Cognitive Science of Religion, Interpreting Human Nature and the Mind. And toward the end, we're also going to talk a little bit about epistemic injustice. So, Dr. Vinten, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to everyone.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me on. I'm flattered to have been invited.
Sure. So I've already had several different cognitive scientists of religion on the show, and that's also one of the main reasons why when I got across your book, I really wanted to invite you on. So, but perhaps the approach that you bring on into this book is different than the one that is more mainstream in the cognitive science of religion. So how do you try to approach religion in the book? Exactly.
Okay, so my background actually isn't in the cognitive science of religion. My background is in philosophy, and particularly the philosophy of Ludwig Wittgenstein. And so I became interested in cognitive science of religion through reading Wittgensteinian critiques of cognitive science. And I thought that those could be applied across over to cognitive science of religion. I saw a lot of the kind of mistakes that were being identified by Wittgensteinians reappearing in the work of cognitive scientists of religion. So I suppose, in one sense, my own personal approach is a critical one from a Wittgensteinian perspective. But within the book, there isn't really a single approach to religion. There's a variety of different contributors from quite different backgrounds. There's Rita McNamara, who's a cross-cultural psychologist. Olympia Panagiotou studies history and uses neurocognitive approaches to studying ancient rituals. There's some people with a background in cognitive science of religion, so Roger Trigg, Hans van Hagen. There's Caspar Hess, who studies social neuroscience, and then there's a variety of philosophers as well. So there's quite a lot of different approaches to religion within the book, and there's disagreements between the authors as well. So in some sense, I would say there isn't a single approach within the book. There's quite a lot of different approaches and disagreements between the different authors. On the other hand, there is commonality between the various authors. There's a common interdisciplinarity, which is something that I emphasize in the introduction. I think that's something that's cognitive scientists of religion agree that their discipline is basically an interdisciplinary discipline, that it takes on board insights from linguistics and psychology, neuroscience, anthropology, and kind of tries to bring all of that evidence together, along with reflections on frameworks and things like that, philosophical reflections as well. So there's a common interdisciplinarity, and Wittgenstein is also a common thread throughout the book. So 10 out of 11 of the chapters discuss Wittgenstein explicitly, and all of the chapters discuss Wittgensteinian themes in one way or another. So yeah, there's those two common elements between the whole book. And one more thing I would say about the book is that it's more philosophical than empirical. So that's another thing that I think the authors have in common, is that it takes a step back from empirical reflections on data about religion or descriptions of religious rituals. It's more about the frameworks through which we view religion, the relationships between the various disciplines via which we might study religion. These kind of philosophical questions are at the center of the book.
And apart from its interdisciplinarity, how would you characterize mainstream cognitive science of religion, and in what ways would you say perhaps it differs from the sorts of approaches that you have in your book?
So the first thing I'd say about cognitive science of religion is that it's a relatively young discipline.
Mm-hmm.
It's been around for about 30 years. If you date it back to Tom Lawson and Robert Macaulay's book, what's it called? Rethinking Religion? Yeah, it's Rethinking Religion.
Mm-hmm.
That book is sometimes identified as the kind of founding document of cognitive science of religion, and that was published in 1990. And so it emphasizes commonalities between participants in religious practices, quite often taking an evolutionary approach to that. So showing that human cognitive abilities have certain things in common as a result of human beings having evolved in a certain way. And then looks at how that might help us to understand religion. And I mean, there are differences between different cognitive scientists, but I suppose we'll get into some of the ways in which the mainstream cognitive scientists of religion do their work.
Yes, we're going to get into some of that later in our conversation, but why Wittgenstein in this particular case? I mean, in what ways, I mean, general ways, because we're going to get into more detail, would you say his work connects to not necessarily the cognitive science, but perhaps more broadly the science of religion?
One reason that I wanted to bring Wittgenstein into this is just my background, that I have a particular interest in Wittgenstein myself. And there has been a bit of an interest amongst Wittgensteinians in cognitive science in recent years. So one of the books that inspired me to take an interest in this was Peter Hacker and Maxwell Bennett's book on the philosophical foundations of neuroscience. And it struck me that a lot of the criticisms of cognitive science and neuroscience that they make in that book can carry over to cognitive science of religion. So that's one reason for bringing Wittgenstein into this. So one of those criticisms is that there's a bit of a tendency within cognitive science of religion to muddle together neuroscientific language and psychological language. So one very straightforward way in which they do that is to talk about the mind as if it's synonymous with the brain, and to use the expressions mind and brain interchangeably. Mm-hmm. Why Wittgenstein was the question?
Yes.
Yeah. So there's lots of reasons actually. So for one thing, Wittgenstein had quite a lot to say about religion in his work, and some of that was commenting on people like James Frazer and the Golden Bough, which I think can be seen as a precursor to the kind of work that you get in cognitive science of religion these days. So it was a scientific attempt to grapple with religious ritual and magic. And Wittgenstein made criticisms of Frazer, which I think carry over to some of the work in cognitive science of religion today. So there's an interest in religion in Wittgenstein. There's also an interest in the correct use of psychological terms, and particularly in terms like belief, knowledge, certainty, in his later work on certainty. Mm-hmm. So I think some of Wittgenstein's reflections on psychological expressions on cognition are going to be relevant as well to cognitive science of religion. Yeah. So.
By the way, since you've already mentioned Wittgenstein's examinations of concepts like belief, knowledge, certainty, and so on, I had this question saved for later in our conversation, but perhaps it's good to introduce it now. How do you think that notions like that, and also notions like thought and faith, would fit into a naturalistic framework? Because since we're talking about the science of religion here, we're basically approaching things through that sort of framework, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think from a Wittgensteinian perspective, you might wonder whether they do fit into a naturalistic framework at all, depending on what you mean by naturalistic. So naturalism is sometimes taken, I think, to be synonymous with scientism. And in that sense, Wittgenstein certainly wouldn't think that you could give a naturalistic account of these psychological expressions. I mean, obviously, this is something that cognitive scientists of religion think you can do. So cognitive science of religion that's exactly what it's all about, right? It's about a scientific investigation of notions like belief and knowledge and faith, from a scientific perspective. I wonder if I might say a bit more later on, I think, about Wittgenstein and naturalism, but that's how I'll answer that one for now.
Okay. And do you know if there's been lots of interaction or not so much between people working in the cognitive science of religion and people working on Wittgenstein's philosophy? I mean, do you know at all if the cognitive scientists of religion, for example, are aware of work on religion done by the Wittgensteinians, and if they take it seriously at all, or if they are aware of it but just don't take it very seriously? I mean, what do you know about it?
I don't think there is a huge amount of interaction between cognitive scientists of religion and Wittgensteinians. I know in the Lawson and Macaulay book that I mentioned before, Rethinking Religion, they mentioned Peter Winch. There's a bit of discussion of Peter Winch there, and they're critical of Peter Winch. And I wonder if that's been influential in putting people off a kind of Wittgensteinian approach to understanding religion. I think probably part of the reason that there hasn't been a huge amount of interaction is just the way in which academia works, that people are divided up into different departments, different disciplines, and they tend to interact with people from their own discipline. So, you know, although I, in the book, say that it's a virtue to kind of have interaction between different disciplines and that it's going to be fruitful, actually in my professional life I tend to mostly mix with other philosophers, and even more than that, I tend to mix particularly with Wittgensteinian philosophers. I go to conferences with Wittgensteinians, and if I'm not going to Wittgenstein conferences, I go to philosophy conferences, and I very, very rarely go to a conference where I'm going to interact with somebody from another discipline. And a lot of people working in the cognitive science of religion work in other departments. They work in religious studies, or they work in psychology, or anthropology. So they probably don't come across philosophers all that much, let alone Wittgensteinian philosophers. So that would be one reason why there's not very much interaction. But it's not as though there's no interaction whatsoever. So some of the contributors to the book, Roger Trigg, he was involved in a project on cognitive science of religion. He's edited a book on cognitive science of religion with Justin Barrett. And he's also written about Wittgenstein in the past. So he has an interest in both. He's quite critical of Wittgenstein, but he at least takes an interest in in Wittgensteinian philosophy, and he's contributed a discussion of Wittgenstein to this volume. Christopher Hoy, one of the other contributors to the volume, I saw him give a presentation on Wittgenstein and cognitive science at a conference in Seville a few years ago, and I was impressed by that, and so I asked him to contribute to the volume. So that there is a bit of awareness between the two camps, and there's some that are not quite in either camp as well. So the Guy Axtell contributes a chapter, and he works in philosophy of religion, but he's not particularly interested in Wittgenstein, and he doesn't focus entirely on cognitive science of religion, but he has a bit of interest in both. But unfortunately, I think that there isn't a huge amount of interaction between the two, and that was one of the motivations for the book, was to bring people together.
And by the way, let me just mention some of the names that you mentioned. There are people that I've had on the show, like Justin Barrett, Robert Macaulay, and also from your own book, I'm releasing an interview with Casper Hesp in just a few months. It's already recorded, but by the time we're recording this one, it's not out yet. And also, I think that on your book, you also have Inez Hipólito.
That's right. Yeah, she writes a chapter jointly with Casper Hesp. Yeah, so she's from a philosophy background, and he's from a neuroscientific background, and they've written a paper together.
Yeah. So I have interviews with all those people on the show if people want to check them out, and also because they might get a little bit more familiar with some of the ideas from both sides here. So,
Sure. It's a wonderful resource, your podcast. I mean, it's enormous, isn't it? The number of interviews that you've done, there's hundreds of them there, and there's, lots and lots of different interesting people to look into. So yeah, I'd recommend that people go and take a look.
Well, thank you so much. And by the way, do you think that perhaps one of the reasons why there's not been lots of interaction between the cognitive scientists of religion and the Wittgensteinians would also have to do with them coming into the discussion or into the science of religion with different theoretical frameworks? Do you think that's perhaps one of the reasons?
Yeah, sure. I mean, but I suppose in both cases there's a broad spectrum of opinion. So within Wittgenstein studies, Wittgenstein's quite a dense and difficult philosopher, and so there's lots and lots of different interpretations given of his work. And within cognitive science of religion, there are obviously differences as well. I mean, we've mentioned people like Macaulay and Lawson and Boyer and Barrett, and I think there's quite a lot of similarities between their work, but there are other people working in the cognitive science of religion who I think are probably closer to a Wittgensteinian kind of approach.
Mm-hmm. And what would you say are the main critiques of contemporary cognitive science of religion by Wittgensteinians, or even cognitive science more broadly?
Okay, so I mentioned the book by Peter Hacker and Maxwell Bennett earlier. That was one of the books that inspired me to engage in this project. Yeah. And the central critique that they make of cognitive science and work in neuroscience that they identify from a Wittgensteinian perspective is that they commit what they call the mereological fallacy. And that's the fallacy of attributing to a part of a thing things that only properly apply to the whole thing. So in particular, they think it's a mistake to apply psychological predicates to something less than a whole creature. And so they're inspired by Wittgenstein's remark. I've got the quote here: only of a living human being and what resembles, in brackets, behaves like a human being, can one say that it has sensations, it sees, is blind, hears, is deaf, is conscious or unconscious. So Wittgenstein there is making a remark about what it makes sense to say. So he thinks it makes sense to ascribe psychological properties to human beings and things that behave like human beings, but not to as a stone or something like that. Mm-hmm. So it makes sense to say Ricardo has a headache. It makes sense to talk about animals having a kind of psychological life. If I see my cat walking out into the garden, looking at a bird and following the bird's movements, chasing it towards a tree, and I see my cat staring up at the tree, I think I could appropriately say that my cat thinks that the bird is up the tree. And that's because the cat exhibits behavior that's similar to human beings in some ways, that it moves towards things that it's interested in and looks at them. And but what that means, if we accept what Wittgenstein says, what it means is that we can't ascribe psychological states to brains or to parts of brains. And that's something that cognitive scientists of religion do all of the time. So Pascal Boyer, whose work I discuss in my chapter, he talks about inference systems in the brain, perceiving things, inferring things, understanding things, all kinds of psychological predicates applied to parts of brains. But of course, parts of brains can't behave in a manner similar to human beings as my cat can. And so it doesn't make sense to talk in that way about parts of brains. So related to that, I think one problem that Wittgensteinians have with both cognitive scientists of religion and with the precursors to the cognitive science of religion is the idea that there's an unwarranted intellectualism in their work. So there's this idea that what they're interested in studying, human cognition, is hidden in people's brains or in their minds, hidden behind behavior, and that it has to be inferred from visible behavior. And so what you need is scientific work in order to uncover what's hidden. And so Wittgensteinians criticize that by saying that this is a kind of a misconceived picture, a Cartesian picture of the mind, where the mind is something inner and private and hidden, and it's entirely logically independent of the behavior of human beings. So I think they're probably the two central critiques. But I mean, there's lots of other things that you can say as well.
Yeah, of course, and the book gets into many more of those critiques, but of course we don't have time to explore them all here today. But going back to the naturalistic bit that I mentioned earlier, so is religion a natural phenomenon, or at least according to the Wittgensteinians, do you think that we should approach religion as a natural phenomenon or not?
Again, I suspect that this is going to be an area where Wittgensteinians probably disagree. I think so. Some Wittgensteinians, I think, are probably going to be resistant to isms altogether, just because of the Wittgensteinian distaste for theory. So there's two philosophers write about naturalism within the book. There's a chapter by Thomas Carroll and there's a chapter by Guy Axtell, and they both look at different aspects of this question. And I myself, I'm inclined to give an answer along the lines that Thomas Carroll does in the book, and it's a kind of it's a bit of a philosopher's answer, to it, and that is to say, well, depends on what you mean by natural, and depends on what you mean by naturalism. And so natural, as it's used by us just in our ordinary language, I think, is used in a way that has lots and lots of different contrasts. It's used with different meanings within our ordinary language. And within technical philosophy as well, naturalism is used in different ways. And so in religion, there's a contrast between the natural and the supernatural. So you might think about that as being the relevant contrast, where what you're thinking about is a distinction between the world as it's studied by science and the supernatural realm of God and angels and spirits. There's a discussion in cognitive science of religion that is discussed in Guy Axtell's chapter, where some cognitive scientists of religion claim that religion is natural, whereas science isn't natural. And what they mean by that is that religion kind of comes easily to us, given that we're the kind of creatures that we are. So we've evolved to have a certain kind of cognitive system, and that cognitive system inclines us towards taking on board certain things quite easily, but not other things. And religion is one of the things that we take on board quite easily, according to some of the people in the cognitive science of religion. So there's a book by Robert Macaulay, which you're probably familiar with. I think is it called "Religion is Natural and Science"?
I think it's "Why Religion is Natural and Science is Not." I think that's the title.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, that's exactly his claim. Is that and there are other philosophers claim similar things. So Boyer makes similar arguments about religious concepts being ones that are easily spread. So religion is something that is easily catches on, whereas science is something that involves counterintuitive conclusions. It involves quite a lot of work. Yeah. It's not something that comes so naturally to us. But so just carrying on with the naturalism thing,
okay,
you might say that there is a kind of naturalism within the work of Wittgenstein. So that's a claim that Thomas Carroll makes in his chapter of the book, and there are elements of Wittgenstein's work that lend support to that interpretation. So there's a passage that Carroll quotes from Wittgenstein's remarks on Fraser's Golden Bough. So Wittgenstein says, "The characteristic feature of the awakening mind of man is precisely the fact that a phenomenon comes to have meaning for him. One could almost say that man is a ceremonial animal." So there it seems that Wittgenstein wants to characterize human beings as having something in common, that they're inclined towards ceremonial or ritualistic behavior, and that they're inclined to find meaning in things. The example that he gives is fire, that people see fire and they're struck by it. It makes an impression on them in a way that it only could to the kind of creatures that we are, creatures who live meaningful lives, who see things in a kind of symbolic way. And you might think that that's something that kind of all human beings share, regardless of whether they're religious or not. There is this symbolic meaning-finding aspect to human beings, and a ritualistic and ceremonial aspect to human beings' lives. So, there are religious ceremonies that are associated with burying people, for example, but it isn't only religious people who engage in ceremonies like that. There's very few people, I think, who, if somebody dies, they say, just stick them in the ground, they're dead now. You need to kind of mark the passing of somebody in some way, to honor their memory, to remember them, these kind of things. And people tend to have a ceremony built around that and get together and celebrate people's lives and, you know, tell stories about people and things like that. So yeah, there's this naturalistic interpretation that you might put on Wittgenstein's work. But as I said before, if naturalism is taken to mean scientism, then I think that's certainly not present in Wittgenstein's work.
Mm-hmm. So there are 2 or 3 other isms that I would like to ask you about here that some of your co-authors also talk about in the book. What about reductionism? I mean, do you think, or would you say that the cognitive science of religion tends to be reductionistic? And if so, in what ways would that be an issue according to the Wittgensteinians?
Okay, so first of all, I'll just say a little bit about what reductionism is. So
Okay.
There's a definition that I pulled up from JJC Smart. He says that X reduces to Y only if X does not exist over and above Y. So there's an ontological spin that you might put on reductionism, where what you're claiming is that if X reduces to Y, then X is nothing but Y, right? In terms of what exists. So you might claim that all of the chemical things that exist are basically made up of atoms, and atoms are more fundamental, and so you might say then that chemistry reduces to physics on that basis. Ontologically, the kind of things that exist in chemistry are just the kind of things that exist in physics and nothing more. But you might also make a claim about reductionism in explanatory terms. So you might say, regardless of whether one thing reduces to another in ontological terms, you might think that things at one level are explainable in terms of things at another level. So it might be that you claim that chemical reactions, things that go on in chemistry, are explainable in terms of the property of atoms and the interaction of atoms. They're explainable in the terms of atomic physics. Mm-hmm. So particularly relevant to the discussions in my book is reductionism from the mental to the physical, or psychological to the neurological. And I think that there is a problematic kind of reductionism present in quite a lot of the work of cognitive scientists of religion. So one of the things that I mentioned before was this tendency to use the word mind and the word brain interchangeably, as if they mean exactly the same thing. And to talk about brain processes, perceiving things and understanding things, I think is another aspect of that. Yeah, so that's how I'd answer that question.
So earlier you've also touched on scientism, and you said basically that Wittgenstein himself and the Wittgensteinians more broadly take issue with it. But what does scientism mean exactly?
So the definition that I use in the book is one taken from Hans-Johann Glock's Wittgenstein dictionary. And Hanjo Glock is a Wittgenstein scholar. He was my supervisor in Reading some years ago, and I think he gives a good definition. So he defines scientism as the imperialist tendencies of scientific thinking that result from the idea that science is the measure of all things. And so, as you say, this is something that you find within the work of Wittgenstein himself. I've got the Blue Book here. And so in the Blue Book, Wittgenstein talks about our craving for generality. And on page 18 of the Blue Book, if anyone wants to look it up, Wittgenstein says, our craving for generality has another main source, our preoccupation with the method of science. I mean the method of reducing the explanation of natural phenomena to the smallest possible number of primitive natural laws. Philosophers constantly see the method of science before their eyes and are irresistibly tempted to ask and answer questions in the way science does. This tendency is the real source of metaphysics and leads the philosopher into complete darkness. So Wittgenstein there is clearly opposed to philosophers conceiving their own work as being something akin to work in the natural sciences. And he doesn't think that you should import methods of the natural sciences into philosophy. He thinks that's a mistake because he thinks philosophical problems are essentially grammatical or conceptual problems, and that what philosophy aims at is understanding through getting to grips with our concepts. The problems that philosophers fall into, they fall into as a result of misusing certain terms that crop up in philosophical problems. So it might be knowledge that gets misused, say, or being. And what the philosopher needs to do is to look carefully at how these terms are ordinarily and correctly used, contrast that with the way that the philosopher is using them, and point out that the philosopher is misusing them in some way according to the ordinary rules for their use. And so they're not talking as we ordinarily do about knowledge or about being. They're talking in some other peculiar philosophical way about things, and that's why they get into a muddle. So there's, within Wittgenstein's work, there's a rejection of scientism in philosophy. But of course, scientism isn't something that is just a problem identified by Wittgensteinians. It's something that the cognitive scientists of religion themselves talk about. They say that they're wary of scientism, that you can't construe all of the disciplines involved in cognitive science of religion as being natural scientific ones. And recently, so as you say, I've been involved recently in a project on epistemic injustice, and I've been reading a book by Jonathan Kahn, Race on the Brain. I don't know if you've come across that.
No.
And he's a legal scholar, and he looks at the way in which legal scholars have looked at scientific work on unconscious bias as a way of resolving legal disputes about racism. And there's a bit of a tendency amongst these legal scholars who look to the implicit bias literature to privilege science over other disciplines. So that he thinks there's a kind of scientism present there. And why is that problematic? Well, because there are psychological or neurophysiological aspects, perhaps, to understanding racism, but that's not the whole story. So part of the story is about the ways in which society is structured, about power relations, about the way in which prejudice is embedded within institutions. And so he objects to thinking about racism just in terms of these biases that people have as individuals. And so there, I think he's identifying a kind of scientism as being problematic within legal studies, an unwarranted privileging of science over humanistic disciplines,
right?
Social scientific disciplines.
So just to cover one more ism here before we get into what you say or what you write about in your chapter on Pascal Boyer's understanding of religion. There's also, you also talk about I mean, by you, I mean you and your co-authors also talk about cultural relativism in the book, and you claim that the cognitive science of religion might have been a response to cultural relativism in a way. So could you explain that? In what ways might it have been a response to that?
Yeah, so relativism looks at differences between cognitive frameworks, between the values and the practices of different societies. So the focus of cultural relativists is going to be on cultural differences in values, and perhaps the worry that these might be incommensurable, that there are conceptual differences in the way that people conceive of time or of color or I suppose particularly significantly or of values, and that there's no way then to resolve differences between the different cultures because they have incommensurable concepts or incommensurable values. Cognitive science of religion, on the other hand, because the focus is on the way in which human beings as a whole have developed evolutionarily and common cognitive features of human beings that result from that common evolutionary heritage, there's an emphasis on what human beings have in common as opposed to what divides them. So cognitive science of religion, I think, sits in contrast to cultural relativism in that way. So human beings have in common, for example, that they tend to over-detect agency. So this is one of the things that gets discussed in cognitive science of religion quite a lot. That human beings, because they evolved to prey upon prey, and because human beings were predated, they needed to look out for other agents in their environment. They needed to look out for food sources, and they needed to also look out for things that might kill them.
I think that there you're referring to what the cognitive scientists of religion call the hyperactive agency detection device.
Yeah, that's one of the ways of referring to it. Yeah. So the hyperactive bit there is that what human beings tend to do is they tend to overestimate the agency in their environment, according to cognitive scientists of religion, because of the way they've evolved, because it's beneficial to human beings to do that, because it's better to think that there's an agent in your vicinity and there isn't, rather than not to identify an agent in your environment that might kill you or might be a source of food. So human evolutionary history explains why humans tend to think that there are more agents in their environment than there in fact are, and they take that to be an explanation for things like seeing spirits or belief in God or
Yeah, I mean, they try to many times boil it down to evolved adaptations in terms of them having increased our fitness, right?
yeah.
Something, they use terms like that, right?
Yeah. So there's things that have aided us in our survival throughout evolutionary history that have kind of structured the way we are cognitively. And that's something that's common to human beings in general. So within Wittgenstein's work as well, there's, as I've already said, there's some emphasis on common features of human beings. So there is this common tendency towards finding meaning in things and to towards ceremony.
Right.
But there is also present within Wittgenstein hints of relativism. So some people have found relativism within Wittgenstein's work. So there is, of course, within Wittgenstein an emphasis on the point that our concepts might have been different than they in fact are. So he likes to imagine circumstances in which in which things in the world are different than they in fact are, and that impacts upon the way in which people categorize things in the world. So there's this emphasis on the possibility of human beings having different concepts, and of course, it's an empirical fact as well that human beings throughout the world do conceptualize things in different ways to each other in certain ways. There's also within Wittgenstein this possibility that people might have different hinges, what he calls hinges. So what he's referring to there is that people might have different certainties, that they might be certain of quite different things. Mm-hmm. And sometimes Wittgenstein puts this into a kind of religious way of thinking about things. So he counterposes the way in which a Catholic might think about things to the way in which a non-Catholic might think about things. So he takes it that it's a hinge or a certainty amongst most non-Catholics that people have two parents. But right. He says Catholics think that Jesus only had one human parent, and he says, and others might think that there are humans with no parents at all. So there's this worry of relativism that arises out of the fact that human beings might have different fundamental religious beliefs, different fundamental values. These are all things that Wittgenstein kind of acknowledges in uncertainty, and which might lead us towards a kind of relativism. So if we think that these fundamental certainties aren't something that we can discuss rationally and come to a resolution of the problem rationally, then you might think that there's a problem of relativism there, that one set of hinges can't be justified relative to another set of hinges.
Mm-hmm. So let's get then into your chapter on Pascal Boyer. So how would you summarize his views, I mean, the way by which he understands and approaches religion?
So we've already mentioned these systems in the brain, and the inference systems, what he calls inference systems, are absolutely central to the way that Pascal Boyer understands religion. So he thinks that we have this agency detection system, the hyperactive agency detective system that you were talking about. He also thinks that we have what he calls an intuitive physics system. Yeah. He thinks that we have something called an intuitive psychology system, which makes inferences about the thoughts and feelings and beliefs of other people. So we have all these things, computational processes going on in our brain, inferences going on that are activated by stimuli in our environment. So the intuitive physics system might be stimulated by seeing one billiard ball hit another billiard ball. I think that's an example that Boyer himself uses, but it's an example that goes back to Hume. And in a sort of Humean fashion, Boyer says that what then happens is that we then infer that there's a cause present between the two events, the event of one billiard ball approaching the other billiard ball and then the other billiard ball moving. The intuitive physics system in our mind infers that there is a cause present when it's stimulated by seeing these events in our environment. So Boyer, he thinks we've got these various systems, and I've got a quote from Boyer here. Let's see if I can find it. Yeah. So these inference systems, they're made to do a huge amount of work in Boyer's book. I think basically they do all of the work really in explaining religion.
Mm-hmm.
So here's a quote from Boyer. He says, "The activation of a panoply of systems in the mind explains the very existence of religious concepts and their cultural success, and the fact that people find them plausible, and the fact that not everyone finds them so, and the way religion appeared in human history and its persistence in the context of modern science." So Boyer basically wants to say that the discovery of these various systems in the brain, cognitive science, it can explain, a huge amount of things that we want to understand about religion. It can explain the spread of religious concepts. It can explain why people engage in certain religious rituals. So I think in summary, that's Pascal Boyer's views that we have these inference systems in our brain, and that if we look at the results of studies in psychology and in cognitive science, they can inform the way in which we understand religion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but by the way, also for the audience, I have a handful of interviews, one of them with Pascal Boyer himself, by the way, where we talk about what people in developmental psychology and some areas of anthropology refer to as core knowledge. That is intuitive physics, intuitive biology, and intuitive psychology. Sometimes instead of intuitive, they use the word folk physics, folk biology, folk psychology. But yeah, I have a handful of interviews with people on the show, evolutionary psychologists, anthropologists, about that. So, and so from a Wittgensteinian perspective, what would be your critique here of those, or that approach based on inference systems?
So, first of all, there's the criticism that I've already mentioned coming from Wittgensteinian philosophers. So the first criticism that we might make of Boyer is that what Boyer is doing here in talking about inference systems in the way that he does is misusing psychological concepts. So Boyer doesn't only say that these inference systems can explain these various aspects of religion, all of the time he's attributing psychological states to these inference systems. So he says that the inference systems perceive things in our environment, that they understand things, that they interpret things. Obviously, being called inference systems, they're inferring things all the time. And so these are the kind of things that we would ordinarily attribute to human beings, right? That human beings compute, that they infer, that they perceive. And so if Wittgenstein's right that psychological expressions are only properly applied to human beings and creatures that behave like human beings, then Pascal Boyer's got to be wrong to attribute psychological states to inference systems in the brain or to any part of the brain, because the brain can't behave like a human being. So that criticism of Boyer is connected with another criticism that we might make. So as Wittgenstein notes, there are behavioral criteria that are associated with psychological concepts. So there's the remark I've already quoted to you where he talks about psychological concepts being attributable to human beings and creatures that behave like them. There's other passages within his work where he talks about how it is that we learn concepts like pain and how it is that we attribute pain to other people.
Yeah.
And his answer to that is that there are behavioral criteria by which we attribute those states to other people. So things like crying and wincing and saying I'm in pain, these kind of behaviors, they're not just kind of accidentally or contingently associated with the mental state in question. There's a logical connection between those behaviors and the pain. And that logical connection is obscured by the fact that people can suppress those behaviors. So people need not behave in that way when they're in pain. People need not give any sign that they're in pain. Or they might pretend to be in pain when they're not. Or they might hide their pain for one reason or another. So there is sometimes a mismatch between what's going on behaviorally and what's going on psychologically. And I think that mismatch between the behavior and the psychology is what has led some people to think that there's no logical connection between the two at all. And that's Boyer's view, right? So Boyer thinks that the internal realm is entirely logically disconnected from the behavioral realm. It's hidden behind behavior rather than the behavior being criteria for the psychological stuff. So a second criticism that you might then make in connection with that is that Boyer holds a kind of Cartesian view of the mind. So although he wouldn't accept that label, he wouldn't think of himself as being Cartesian. So he doesn't believe in the Cartesian view that there's a material substance and an immaterial substance. That's not what I'm referring to here. But what he does believe, and that Descartes believes, is that there is a logical disconnection between the mental or the psychological realm and the physical and the behavioral realm. And that what we have to do, because thoughts are hidden, we have to infer psychology from their behavior. So there's a kind of Cartesian aspect to Boyer's work and lots of other work in the cognitive science of religion, which I think is problematic from a Wittgensteinian perspective. Okay, I'll leave it at that for now.
Okay, and I guess that also sort of related to what you talked about when you mentioned intuitive physics, biology, and psychology. There's also this very common idea among researchers in the cognitive science of religion about theory of mind or mind reading, and how this sort of Western model of the mind would also apply cross-culturally across all cultures. So I mean, from a Wittgensteinian perspective, what do you think about that? And if it doesn't apply cross-culturally, what would be the implications for the study of religion?
So I think this is a further criticism that you can make of Boyer's work, actually, is that there's a kind of scientism present in Boyer's work. Mm-hmm. So what it means, that this strict division between the inner and the outer, it means that there's always work to be done in uncovering what's going on in the inner realm. And so this is where science comes in, right? So the idea then is that cognitive science is needed to uncover what is hidden. And that's also related to the idea of a theory of mind, I think. The idea that there's something theoretical about the way in which we attribute psychological states, beliefs, pains, etc., to our fellow human beings. So I think as a Wittgensteinian, I'm very wary of this talk of theory of mind at all. I think it's a bit of an odd way of talking about things. I don't think babies or chimpanzees or adult human beings have a theory of mind unless they're doing psychology, right? Just attributing mental states to other people, that's a perfectly ordinary, everyday, non-theoretical activity. But the reason that people think of it as something theoretical, I think, is that they're holding on to this kind of Cartesian picture where the inner is something hidden that has to be unburied by science. It's a bit like you have to observe certain things in order to detect what's going on with atoms that are hidden. The psychological is conceived in a similar way to the atomic. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a mistaken analogy, that the psychological isn't analogous to the atomic in that way.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, of course, as I said, there are many other critiques that you and your co-authors explore in your book. But now for the last part of our conversation, I would like to ask you actually about a new project that you're working on right now on epistemic injustice. Could you tell us a little bit about that? And by the way, just to introduce the topic for the audience, I mean, what is epistemic injustice exactly?
Okay, so the term was coined by Miranda Fricker in her book Epistemic Injustice, which has become a bit of a classic in the field that's inspired a lot of the work in the field. And she distinguishes two kinds of epistemic injustice, two basic kinds of epistemic injustice: testimonial injustice and hermeneutical injustice. So what she's talking about are injustices that are connected with human beings as being knowing and believing creatures. So that's the epistemic side of things, right? So epistemology is the theory of knowledge, or the study of knowledge, belief, and justification. So epistemic injustice is injustice in the area of epistemic things, so injustice in relation to knowledge and belief and justification. So in particular, testimonial injustice that Fricker talks about, this is the injustice of somebody offering up testimony and not being believed due to a prejudice that the hearer has. And so the speaker here, the person giving their testimony, is trying to convey some information to somebody else. They're perfectly believable. There's no reason to disbelieve them, let's imagine. But the hearer nonetheless does not believe them because they're prejudiced in some way, because they're racist or because they're sexist, or because they're homophobic. They think that the person in question, isn't trustworthy on this issue, when in fact they have no reason to think that this person is untrustworthy. So in that case, an epistemic injustice has been done to that person. They're a victim of prejudice, but they're also a victim of prejudice in their capacity as a knower and as somebody offering up knowledge to other people. So the other form of epistemic injustice that Miranda Fricker talks about is hermeneutical injustice. And that's the injustice of people not having the hermeneutical resources to understand their own oppressed condition. So the example that she gives is the example of sexual harassment. So the concept of sexual harassment is a relatively recent one, and until women got together and discussed what was happening to them in the workplace, the abuses that they were facing, until they started to conceptualize it as sexual harassment, they didn't fully understand their own oppression, the way in which they were being harassed. So there are gaps in the conceptual resources in society, the hermeneutical resources more generally, that are unfavourable to certain people, that she points to. So they're the two forms of epistemic injustice that Miranda Fricker talks about, but you might think that it's broader than that, right? So Fricker doesn't own epistemic injustice, and I mean, it's quite natural to expand the term in certain ways. So if what we're talking about is injustices done to people in their capacity as knowers, then we might think that there's various other forms of epistemic injustice. So one form of epistemic injustice that people have pointed to is that oppressed people might in fact have better hermeneutical resources than their oppressors for understanding their situation. So it might be that oppressed people, in virtue of being oppressed, have a better understanding of their condition than the people that are oppressing them. But nonetheless, the conceptual resources that are available within society don't reflect that. So there are gaps in the conceptual resources of the people that aren't oppressed in that way. And so the people that aren't oppressed, or perhaps the people doing the oppressing, they're the ones that have gaps in their conceptual resources. And that's a problem for the oppressed, because people within the society don't understand their oppression. So it might be that, I don't know, say Black people have a very good understanding of the ways in which they're being oppressed, but other people in that society don't have the conceptual resources that the oppressed people do. And that is therefore a problem for the people that are oppressed, because they try to talk to other people about their oppression and don't get understood as a result of that. Or it might be that the misunderstanding is willful, right? So it might be that the people doing the oppressing recognise that there are certain gaps in the collective hermeneutical resources that disadvantage people, and they might deliberately obscure those hermeneutical resources. I think I've rambled enough there, but I just want to give an impression of how you might broaden things out. So you know, there's all kinds of directions that you might go off in discussing epistemic injustice. If you're thinking about justice in the area of people being oppressed in their capacity as knowers, then you're thinking about epistemic injustice, and that might take a number of different forms.
Right. So just one more question then. Here in the particular case of epistemic injustice, you're also bringing into the table Wittgenstein and his philosophy, right? Particularly, I guess, his philosophy of language, if I understand it correctly. So in what ways would the Wittgensteinian approach here also apply or be relevant to discussions of epistemic injustice?
Okay, so I mean, I've only just started this project myself, so I haven't actually written a huge amount on how this might work out. But in very sort of broad brushstroke terms, Wittgenstein, as I say, he conceived of philosophy as being concerned with conceptual or grammatical problems. And given that a lot of the discussions within the field of epistemic injustice are philosophical and conceptual, it's clear that Wittgenstein's philosophy is going to have an application then. So one of the things that I started looking at is the question of the relationship between knowledge and certainty. So this is something that Fricker raises in her book, Epistemic Injustice. She wonders whether there's a confidence condition to knowledge, whether people have to be confident of whatever it is that they know in order to be said to know, or whether they have to be certain in order to know. And obviously, Wittgenstein's work is useful in reflecting on the relationships between knowledge and certainty. He wrote on certainty, which contains, lots of interesting reflections on how exactly knowledge and certainty are related to each other, and how exactly we are to understand knowledge and certainty. So I think that's just one example of how Wittgenstein might be useful in understanding issues of epistemic injustice. I'm not the first to do this. So Wittgenstein's work has been used in discussions of epistemic injustice already. So one of the ways in which it's been used is to think about the potential for Wittgenstein's understanding of hinge epistemology to be used in discussions of epistemic injustice. And there are discussions of Wittgenstein and relativism and epistemic injustice. Lots and lots of different ways in which you might go off.
Great. So just to mention your book again, it's Wittgenstein and the Cognitive Science of Religion, Interpreting Human Nature and the Mind. I'm leaving a link to it in the description of the interview. And Dr. Vinten, just before we go, apart from the book, would you like to tell people where they can find you and your work on the internet?
Yeah, so I'm affiliated to NOVA University, as you say. In particular, I'm affiliated to IFIL-NOVA, which is the philosophy institute at NOVA. I'm a researcher there, so I have a page on the IFIL-NOVA website. That's ifilnova.pt, if people want to look me up there. I also have an academia page, a ResearchGate page, the usual kind of research pages. I'm on those if people want to look me up there. And I'm also a member of the Lisbon Mind and Cognition group, and I have a page on their webpage. So if people want to look me up on that page, you can do. And that's an interesting group as well if people want to look into the activities of the Lisbon Mind and Cognition group.
Okay, great. So thank you so much again for taking the time to come on the show. It's been a real pleasure to talk with you.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me onto the show. It's great. Thanks.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Erga Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingford, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Mikkel Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Ford, Tiago Nunes, Fergal Cossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Librant, João Linhares, Stantantia, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Dana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavla Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Alman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeager, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Lowacki, Georgios Theophanes, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry Dealey Jr., Old Erringbone, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismail Ben-Sliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Jos Necht. A special thanks to my producers, Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Ugnik, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, John Carlo Montenegro, Alnick Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, Bogdan Kanivets, and Rosie. Thank you for all.